Welcome everyone to Freight and Salvage. I'm Susan Hoffman, the director of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and it's delightful to see all of you here. I want to welcome my distinguished colleagues, Martha Olney, Robert Reich, and David Robinson. In less than 2 weeks, many of us are going to be back here in this room again for the spring open house that will take place on March 16th. It's a time when we bring faculty and members together. The faculty talk about the courses that they'll be offering, and just note that the term will start March 29th and run for 6 weeks. We also have a second offering of our online course in collaboration with Professor Dan Kamen on the challenge of energy resources and policies, which will begin on March 29th. I'm very excited with the way this course has been going this term. We've had Dan Kamen calling in from Oxford, England yesterday, Matt Wald from the New York Times in from the newsroom in Washington. We've had 4 countries and a dozen of the states of the United States being represented in these conversations online. It's a course that is covering the range of challenges, and it's focusing a lot on policies and what we can do. So I hope if you yourself are interested, if you could tell others that this opportunity will start again March 29th. And then finally, for something entirely new, to further our mind-body adventure, we're planning the first 2 one-week programs in Mexico's Tehama, a new wellness resort in Nueva Vallarta. And so in May, we'll be looking at the democratization of Latin America, and in June, looking at the issues of energy and the environment. Professor Alex Zaragoza will be with us during the democratization week, and Dan Kamen and others will be with us on the energy. Each of these subject areas are designed to not only bring Berkeley faculty down to Mexico to be with us for the week, they're also designed for those professors to bring noted colleagues from Mexico, so that the benefit will be that there'll be a reciprocity and conversation between our countries, which we think will be fairly exciting to participate in. There will also be attention paid to health and wellness and to creative expression. So it's a really fun-filled week for those of us who like to use both mind and body. And then to shift gears to the moment. 1 year ago, our esteemed speakers spoke with you in a series that we called From Boom to Bust: Insights into the Economic Downturn. Today, we are gathered as colleagues and OLLI members, as well as our online audience, to discuss the wisdom and the pain of 1 year later. Questions still remain on how our global economy got here and what we need to do, not only as individuals, but also as a society. Martha Olney will begin the session and will serve as moderator. Martha Olney.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you. This one. Thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate your attendance and appreciate the opportunities that OLLI offers to all of you and to us as well. OLLI strikes me as the sort of institution that my aunt and uncle, who were old blues from the war years, would have absolutely loved. And my Auntie Ruth and Uncle David, were they still here, would be right in the front row. So it's fabulous to see you all here. Thank you for your afternoon. I am Martha Olney. I'm an adjunct professor of economics in the economics department here at UC Berkeley. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll let my colleagues tell you a little bit about themselves. And then the way we have this set up is I have a little bit of a slideshow to show you, just to give you some quick pictures of where the economy has been over the last year plus. And then we're each going to talk a little bit about what our insights are today relative to a year ago. We'll bounce the conversation around a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers. So that's the plan for the afternoon. So once again, I'm Martha Olney from the economics department, and in terms of my teaching, I teach, we all three actually teach in Wheeler Auditorium. How many people had a class in Wheeler Aud at some point in life? It's still the same. So it is. It's still large, and we're still way up there, and you can't see us. We all teach today in Wheeler Odd. I'm doing Econ 1, and I focus my interests and research on macroeconomics and economic history. And let me let you introduce yourself.
My name is Robert Reich. I'm a professor at the Goldman School at Berkeley. And what else can I say? That's about it. I've been around.
Cabinet member. You could say cabinet member.
I could.
Yeah. Good afternoon. My name's Dave Robinson. I am a lecturer at the Haas School of Business.
Okay, there we go. So let me start by showing you some pictures. Just out of curiosity, how many of you were at the series that we did a year ago? Fabulous. Okay. So my first two slides are just a repeat of what I said a year ago, which was a year ago what we realized was that there were two issues that confronted us. One was the financial crisis, which was that the banks and the financial institutions had stopped lending. And the other is the economic crisis, the macroeconomic crisis, which a year ago was just beginning to sort of rear its ugly head. A year ago, remember, was when unemployment was falling, maybe 700,000 or so jobs. Employment was falling, 700,000 or so jobs per month. The unemployment rate was still down in January, February, around 7, I think it was, 6 or 7%, 6.5%, 7% a year ago. And so the macro crisis, I think, has really unfolded much more in the last year than it had a year ago. One of the things I said then was what matters to who has jobs is how much we produce. And what matters to how much is produced is whether or not somebody's going to buy what we produce. And so if there is no what we call aggregate demand, if no one wants to buy, let's say, a Berkeley education, then there will not be people who produce Berkeley educations. If nobody wants to buy, my favorite example, 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt, then no one's going to produce 6-ounce cups of chocolate-flavored frozen yogurt. And so when we look at a macroeconomic downturn such as the one that we're in, we look at why we've gone down and where the return is going to come from. To answer both of those questions, we look at the sources of spending. So who is spending, who is not spending, and where is the spending going to come from? Economists divide the total spending in the country into 4 groups, so that we have households who do what we call consumption spending. We have businesses that buy equipment and build buildings. We have government, importantly, not just federal, but state and local as well, a point we'll come back to. State, local, and federal governments who purchase things and pay their employees. And we have the rest of the world. So the rest of the world purchases the things that we produce here and sell to others abroad. And of course, we buy things that were produced in the rest of the world. And so if we want to understand why the downturn and we want to understand how long it's going to take for the economy to recover, we focus our energy on understanding consumption, investment, government, and net exports. One of the things I think is important to understand as you listen to the news is the definitions of recession and recovery. A lot of people are stunned when they hear economists say the recession is over. How could you possibly say the recession is over when unemployment is still 10%? And it has to do with the definitions that we use. So a recession is defined as when the total amount of output in the economy is decreasing, when there's less produced in February than was produced in January, and less produced in January than was produced in December. So when the total amount of output is going down, we say we're in recession. Once we hit the bottom and start to come back up, we're in recovery. Being in recovery, I'm going to guess a few people in the room have done the hospitalization thing. Being in recovery, is it the same thing as being fully recovered? No, right? How do you feel when you first go into recovery? Right? Exactly. So this economy may be in recovery, but we feel about as good as you did when you came out of the operating room. All right? So we've turned the corner. Things are starting to improve, but it's still a long ways until we're fully recovered. So let me show you some graphs. I've taken these from what's one of my favorite blogs, is the Calculated Risk blog. It's a blog that has a lot of information about the macroeconomy and fabulous graphs every day, lots and lots of them. So this, actually I lied. This first thing is from the God, what's it called? The Economic Report of the President, which is an annual report that's issued by the Council of Economic Advisors, which is currently chaired by our colleague Christina Romer. And here's their forecast. So this is the Obama administration's economic forecast. And the first column, which you may not be able to see, but I'm going to highlight the key ones, shows you what do they think is going to be the growth of GDP, which is the total amount of output that's produced. And, oh, I focused on the wrong column. Well, that's okay. So they've got the total GDP is going to grow in 4% this year if you take and let prices count for some of the increase, and 3% this year if you control for prices. That sounds pretty good. That's why they say we're in recovery, because the total amount of output that's being produced, which we measure with GDP, doesn't have a minus sign in front of it. So it had a minus sign in front of it in 2009 and 2008, so it was going down. But now there's no minus sign, there's a plus sign in front of it. The total amount of output is going up, which is to say we're in recovery. And, whoops, where do we go? This way. Oh, I forgot I had it do that. Isn't that clever? Now, unemployment. What most people care about is not GDP. Most people don't really give a hoot about what's happening in GDP. Most people care about unemployment. They care about whether or not folks have jobs. And so the column I've highlighted here is the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate was 5.8% in 2008, and they project that it doesn't get back to 5.5% until 2016. And that's why I called that 8 long years. The reason we call the 1930s the Great Depression of the 1930s is not because the economy was going down for the entire decade of the 1930s. The economy went down from September of 1929 through March of 1933, and then it took from March of 33 through December of 1941, when some event we may remember happened. It took until December of 41 for the economy to get back to where it had been before it turned down in 1929. And so what the administration is projecting is that we're not going to get back to a 5.5% unemployment rate until 2016. This is going to be a decade that's going to have a name, whether it's going to be the decade of the Great Recession or I don't know what we're going to call it, but 10, 20 years from now, this decade's going to have a name because of this very long, slow recovery. So let me show you quickly, if I can, some pictures. This is the unemployment rate. These charts don't all start in the same year, and so under the heading, I always put up there what year it starts in. The blue line shows the unemployment rate, and you can see here the period that we're in right now is known for the rapidity of the worsening, right? So that things went bad really fast. So it wasn't a gradual increase in the unemployment rate, but you look at the rate at which this unemployment rate climbs from 5.5% to 10%, and it was shoop, right? So a year ago, we were in the midst of, if you turn it upside down, which you have right here, the free fall. And the bottom number is showing employment, so it's showing that we have stopped. The fact that that has hit a bottom and gone back up means we're no longer losing jobs at as fast a pace as we were earlier, okay? So we're no longer getting sick as fast as we were. We're getting sick much more slowly. There was a month when we had a slight increase in the number of jobs, and then in the revision, I think that disappeared. The unemployment numbers will come out this Friday. There's all sorts of press ahead of time to try to lower everybody's expectations for what happens, because the unemployment numbers that will come out this Friday for February were based on a survey that was done during the week of the big blizzard back east when everything was closed for a week, and so they think the unemployment rate this Friday may be really high. So don't read anything at all into what you hear in the news this Friday. Okay, real GDP, which is the total amount of output that's produced, is down. This one starts in 1947, and that red line is showing you every time there's a drop in GDP is the red line dripping down. And so it's down, but there's 1958 when it dropped almost 4%. There's today when it dropped almost 4%. And here's a general definition. There isn't, if you look up in a textbook, there's not one definition, but sort of a general definition of depression might be a 10% drop in GDP. So GDP, the total amount of stuff that we produce, is definitely down. It's down as badly in this period as it was in the 1958 downturn, but we're not in a Great Depression in the sense of huge, huge, huge drops in the total amount of output. But what about some of the pieces? Housing construction. So here's housing construction and cliff diving. What you see as you look at the graphs on this calculated risk blog is over and over and over you see what they call the cliff diving. So the shoop, right? So, and this actually peaks in about 2006. Similar to the Great Depression when housing construction peaked in 1926, housing construction peaked before the downturn began. The peak to trough, whoops, I'm not used to this clicker. The jump from peak to trough is a drop of about 4 percentage points as a share of GDP. That's really big. There's no other decline in this 1947 on period that's as big. So we've had a larger drop in housing construction than we'd had in the post-World War II period. This is looking at commercial real estate, which a lot of people say is the next shoe that's going to drop. There's the two periods, the two circles. The first one is 1982, and the second one is today. Now, does anybody remember what happened in 1982, 83, early 1980s? What happened to interest rates? Anybody remember? Really, really high. Exactly right. So what happened? The reason that this decline happened here in the early 1980s is that interest rates were like 18%, and construction, you know, you put interest rates at 18%, and construction basically has a coronary. Today, interest rates are essentially zero. Right? Money market fund statement came the other day, Odette, and it was 0.01%. God. And so here with interest rates extremely low, we have a similar drop in construction of commercial real estate. The red line at the top is showing you the equipment. So that's the equipment part of investment spending. Consumption is the big question because consumption is 2/3 of total spending. And so the big question is what's going to happen to consumption. In typical recessions, real estate and consumers lead, construction of real estate and consumers lead us out of the recession and into recovery. So far, we don't see that happening in construction because of the big hangover of houses with the foreclosures. And in consumption, what you can see here is let me say I added a line. The line sort of traces out what's happening. The big drop in consumption that happened in 2008 and 2009, so that's why we lost so many jobs so quickly. Consumption has started to come back up. And the question is whether or not this blue line here is going to continue rising. If you figure, well, let's see, if I'd started this line here and continued it, where would it be? Are we going to get back to where consumption would have been in the absence of the downturn? That's a good question. One of the related questions is what's going to happen to the saving rate. Saving is how much out of our take-home pay do we set aside? And the saving rate had declined from about 10% in the early 1980s down to essentially zero a couple of years ago. And as savings declined, people were spending, and they were spending as if there was no tomorrow. And that spending was fabulous for creating jobs, right? There were lots of jobs. You know, I don't know where y'all live, but I drive Calusa to go home to El Cerrito, and there's that kitchen sink store that's right there on the corner of Calusa and Solano, right? There's stores that exist right now, so you can go in and design your kitchen and have everything match everything else in your kitchen. There weren't stores like that 10 years ago, right? Those stores exist because of the spending boom that was financed by the fact that we weren't saving, and in fact, we were borrowing. And what were we borrowing on? We were borrowing on our houses. And this is showing how much of the equity that's in our houses did we take out. And so this is showing how much equity we've taken out of our houses as a share of our take-home pay. So it's sort of how much do we boost our spending, how much do we boost our pay by using our houses as ATMs. And what you can see is here's the boom that gave us things like the kitchen sink store at Calusa and Solano. And here is what's happened in the last couple of years. So once housing prices started to decline, those home equity lines of credit disappeared or shrank. And the amount that we've taken out of our house is now actually negative, which means we're paying back more on our home equity loans than we're taking out for the nation as a whole. Okay? Now, that may be good for us individually in terms of our individual personal finances, but for the economy as a whole, the kitchen sink store I'm predicting is going to go out of business relatively soon. I don't know anything. I haven't ever been in it. I've only walked by it. But I can imagine that having a store that's based on synchronizing, it's sync, S-Y-N-C, synchronizing your fixtures in your kitchen is not going to have a long lifespan when we're no longer taking money out of our home equity to redo our kitchens and give ourselves the fancy kitchen. A lot of this, of course, comes from foreclosures. Here's a picture that shows you starting in 2005 what's happened to foreclosures. So the red is the foreclosures, the blue is delinquent, which presumably will eventually become foreclosures. This is for subprime loans, and this peak here is 45%. So it's peaking up here at about 42%. So it's saying that what do I want? 2 out of 5 subprime mortgages were delinquent or in foreclosure in the end of 2009. Here's prime loans, and you see, so there's big, quick shoot up there. There's big, quick, a little bit later shoot up there. So all that subprime has on prime is that subprime shoots up faster in terms of the foreclosure behavior, but now prime is shooting up. The prime loans are shooting up in terms of foreclosures largely because of the unemployment rate. So all this stuff sort of circles back. The scales are different though. So if I put them on the same, if I shrink the prime loans, which is on the bottom, so it's sort of on the same scale, you can see they have the same pattern in terms of shooting up, but the subprime is about 4 times as bad in terms of the likelihood of foreclosure as the prime. Okay. And all of this ignores the problem that we will be able to think about even more tomorrow with the big March 4th strike and rally in March and whatever else is happening tomorrow, is the states. So the states, most of the states have balanced budget requirements that they can't spend more than they take in revenue. Their revenues come from property taxes, but as the property taxes go, as the property values go down, the property tax revenue goes down, and as there's fewer sales, the transfer taxes go down. Their revenue comes from income taxes, but as we have unemployment, less income tax revenue. Their revenue comes from sales taxes, but if we're not spending and buying, you know, those kitchen sinks that people were putting in their houses, they paid sales taxes on them. So all of these things are decreasing, putting enormous stress on the revenue sources for the state governments. The state governments have to cut their spending to match their revenue if they can't increase their revenue. And then you get things like furloughs, which we're not going to talk about, and cuts in funding of education, which the students will talk about tomorrow, and other things. So that's sort of where we are and where we've been, and gives you kind of a macro overview. And I just ended with what I think is the swallow hard picture, which was the one I started with, which was the 8 long years. And with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Bob Reich.
Well, thank you, Martha, for that upbeat presentation.
What can I say?
What I take away from that, and I believe it as well, is that there is room for optimism because things are getting worse more slowly.
That's right.
I think that a year ago when we got together, and certainly I remember I guess January a year ago, I was testifying before Congress with 2 other people, and the question that Congress wanted answered at that time was how large a stimulus package was going to be necessary in order to get the economy back on track. The implicit question was, what's the gap between the capacity of the economy at near full employment and what we were then likely to be producing? The 2 others who were testified before I did, the person sitting next to me first and then the other person next to him. And both of them came up with a figure close to about $800 billion as the ideal stimulus. The person who testified first said $800 billion, and then when the second person was testifying, I leaned over and said, whispered, "Where did you get that figure?" And he said, "I made it up." I can't emphasize more to you the sense that everybody had a year or a year and a half ago that we were on uncharted terrain. We didn't know where we were going, and there is still a lot of that sense. And I want to emphasize a couple of things. Again, I am upbeat in 2 respects, because business cycles are business cycles, And a business cycle follows the reverse of Isaac Newton's law when it's at the bottom, and that is that everything that's down eventually goes up. And more specifically, consumers have got to replace appliances and cars and all kinds of big consumer durables. Businesses have to replenish inventories. I mean, there's a kind of a natural process. You get to the bottom and things eventually have to turn up. What I'm worried about is what happens when the stimulus, which, by the way, in my view, turned out to be way too small, when the stimulus is over and the Fed begins to tighten again, raising interest rates, which it's going to have to do eventually. It's already saying that it is ending its support of or buying of mortgage-backed securities, probably about April, which means that it is already in the process of shrinking the money supply. Now, the big question mark hanging over all of this, and Martha alluded to it, I want to talk about it a little bit more, and then I'm going to give it to David, then we'll have a discussion about this and more, is where is aggregate demand going to come from? Because consumers are not just where they are typically at the end of a recession. Consumers still have a lot of debt. Consumers are also traumatized by the amount of unemployment. And you know the official unemployment rate radically understates the true extent of the fear and anxiety and lack of employment out there, because it does not take account of all the people who are working part-time, who'd rather be working full-time, need to be working full-time. It doesn't take account of all of the people who are too discouraged even to look for work to begin with. It only looks at people who are actively looking. And it does not deal with all of the people who are working in jobs but getting paid far less than they were getting paid before. And a lot of people are in that category. When you look at the total, including all of those three, you are talking about a very high rate of unemployment. Now, it does track the amount of education you have. If you are well educated, if you have a college degree, you're going to not suffer nearly the degree of actual underemployment that somebody who has dropped out of high school is suffering. But the great American middle class, that is the engine of consumer demand and has been keeping the economy going like Energizer bunnies, recession or no recession over the last 30 years, is beginning to have to face some unpleasant truths. And the most unpleasant truth that we have dodged for years, and I don't know how we avoid it in the future, is that median wages adjusted for inflation have barely budged. Median family incomes adjusted for inflation are slightly above what they were 30 years ago, but not by much. Spending has gone up over the last 10 years, even 20 years or 30 years, but a lot of that is, first of all, because women went into the paid workforce in large numbers, and secondly, because everybody worked longer hours, and third and finally, as Martha alluded to, because we could treat our houses as ATM machines because housing prices were going up and everybody assumed they would continue to go up and grow up. But those days all seem to be over. We've exhausted all of those coping mechanisms. And some people believe, and I'm among them, that the long-term challenge is not just jobs. The long-term challenge is wages. It's not really all that hard, if you think about it, to create a lot of new jobs if everybody's willing to work for peanuts. The problem that I view as the core problem here that's been hidden for years, and we've hit it very well, is that globalization, one of those wonderful words that's gone from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. But by globalization, I mean the mere fact that there are more and more people, because of the technologies of communication, transportation, cargo ships, satellite communications technologies, there are so many more millions and millions of people around the world who are willing to work and produce things that Americans had been producing. And these other people around the world are getting more and more productive at doing it, and so therefore can do it much more cheaply than a lot of Americans can. And secondly, we have a lot of new technologies, beginning with internet and computers, that can do almost any routine job much more cheaply than most Americans can do a routine job, even if it's here at home. add up globalization and also the effects of technology, labor-saving technologies, and it may be that a large portion of the American middle class has priced itself out of competition in terms of the wages that we've been used to getting. And if that's the case, we are in trouble, not only in terms of consumer demand, but also in terms of the whole idea of what the American middle class is all about. We also face a raging problem of inequality, which we need to face and we need to talk about. I'm certainly willing to talk about it here, even though every time I do, I'm accused of class warriorship. Anyway, on that also upbeat note.
Upbeat.
David.
They don't call it the dismal science for nothing.
Good afternoon. I want to go a little further down that theme of globalization. When I spoke with you last year, I gave you some models for what our future might be like. And one model is that we could be like Japan, that we could have 10, 20 years of government overspending, great public works projects, vastly escalate the national debt, and have zero economic growth for 2 decades. It's the Japanese model. The alternative I suggested was that we should be like Denmark and drive one decent Volvo, and that we get our economy downsized. And I had a picture of a guy on The Biggest Loser, and I suggested that we, having been overblown, with all of the money coming out of the houses and going to the sink store, people right out of college, in the great scheme of the universe, they're not required to have an apartment with 2 bathrooms and a granite countertop. We can live fine. I had a very good life with Formica. So we were given the prompt to ask what's different. And I realized, thinking about the talk today, that we do have another model, and it's the model that we have embraced, and the model is Greece. In a very short period of time, we'll have as much national debt relative to our GDP as Greece does, and we will be going to our state employees, of which I'm one, and telling them that they can face a layoff or they can face a reduction in salary. And if you watch the news, you saw that that's exactly the offer that Mayor Gavin Newsom gave everybody except police and fire who work for San Francisco yesterday. In Greece, just so as you know what it's going to look like, the VAT, value-added tax, you can think of that as a sales tax, it went up from 19% to 21.5%. If we were to get our budget in balance, we would have to pay another 40% more in income taxes. My text for today is "We are toast." I enjoyed hearing Professor Reich speak last year, and I ended listening to his talk by thinking, oh, it's okay. If I may quote you, you said, we'll stimulate, and if that doesn't work, then we'll stimulate a little bit more, right? And so over the Christmas break, I read this great book on Keynes, Return of the Master, by Lord Skidelsky, and it pretty much says the same thing. And I thought, well, maybe that's what we have to do. I don't worry a lot about Keynesianism. First of all, it never seems to me that any Keynesian is really a true Keynesian. When we get into budget surplus, they never seem to pay down anything. They just have new programs. So it's always borrow and borrow more, and then borrow more and spend more. And then I read Where Keynes Went Wrong, a book that I strongly recommend to you by Hunter Lewis, not the most perfectly written book, but he points out that Keynesian theory is kind of like string theory. It's untestable. And if you stimulate and you've still got high unemployment, you say, well, we didn't stimulate enough, let's stimulate some more. And I think that what we need to do is actually to get our economy right-sized. and to have lowered expectations for GDP and lowered expectations for our middle class lives. How I explain this to the undergraduates, I think I may have used this analogy last year. I view our federal situation as no different than the undergraduate who has a reasonably good life, about $200 a month for beer, going out for pizza, and he gets very frustrated because his roomie has a flat panel TV, takes people over to San Francisco for dinner, goes up to Tahoe skiing on the weekends, and one day our student comes in and finds the roommate with his head in his hands saying, "I'm in a really bad way. I'm $15,000 out on my credit card and I don't know what's going to happen next." Well, if that happened to anyone that we knew, the first thing that we would do is we would say, stop spending. Don't go up to Tahoe. And I made the comment about a cabinet member. I think I said last year that you were cabinet member for Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton was staffed with a lot of Berkeley economists. And as I understand it, the Berkeley economists pointed out to him that he needed to raise taxes a little bit, not so much as to kill off the economy, and that if he did that over 3 or 4 years, the budget would come into balance. Once the federal budget was in balance, interest rates would lower, and we'd have this great period of prosperity. He did, and we had. That's exactly what happened. But there's another side to that. Don't you think that Bill Clinton wanted to have a prescription drug benefit? Don't you think, whatever the rights and demerits of No Child Left Behind, don't you think that Bill Clinton wanted to be writing checks for $100 billion to this state and $100 billion to that state for education? We simply can't afford it. We don't have this money. It all started when, after 9/11, we prosecuted a war without paying for it. And we just very nicely got into the habit of borrowing that money. And nobody ever told me when we were ever going to pay it back. Now we're borrowing more money for a stimulus. Nobody's told me exactly when that ever gets paid back. The budget projections are simply awful. And so we're toast. Thank you.
Wheat or cinnamon raisin? Neither. Okay. Gosh, well, there's lots for us to talk about.
What do you put on the tone?
Yeah. So, do you want to leap in, or you want me to sort of blather on here?
My only point is that I certainly understand and sympathize with David's concern about the debt. But there really are two ways of thinking about debt. One is in the short term, and then there's the long-term structural debt. In the short term, just going back to Martha's initial analysis, if we don't have enough demand, we are not going to get people back to working and into jobs and the economy growing again. And when the private sector is reluctant to spend because it doesn't know that there are consumers out there to buy, and when consumers are very reluctant to spend because they don't have jobs, or they're worried about losing their jobs, or they have huge debt overhangs, or whatever reason, and when we cannot count on exports, and exports are really a small part of our market, and net exports are probably not going to carry us very far anytime soon, whether you like it or not, regardless of your ideology, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or Republican, you've got to understand that we've got to rely on government as the spender of last resort. I remember when I was a little boy, my father said, "Bobby, you and your children and your children's children and their children will be paying down the debts of Franklin D. Roosevelt." And I was scared. I didn't know what a debt was, but I couldn't sleep. Well, what happened? I mean, the fact of the matter is that in 1945, the ratio of debt to the whole national product was about 120%. That was awful. But what happened was not that we got the numerator down, the debt down so much, because we kept on spending on the military. We had a Cold War, a Korean War, and so forth. The big change was economic growth, the denominator of that equation. And as long as we get the debt GDP ratio down, as long as we get back to growth, we can solve the long-term structural problems. Now, the biggest long-term structural problem, just this one point, Martha, the biggest long-term structural problem is not Social Security, it is Medicare.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And that is something that I hope the debt commission that the president has just put together really focuses on. And Medicare is a huge problem because of two things. One, because the baby boomers are all moving toward the years where they're going to need a lot of health care. And number two, because even if they weren't, healthcare costs are rising at an extraordinary rate because our system is so damn inefficient. So we got to deal with all of that.
Thank you. Which was, I was going to say healthcare as well. And one of the things that's interesting about the last couple of years is when you look at employment sector by sector, the only sector in the American economy that has grown in terms of the number of jobs over the last 2 years is the healthcare sector. That every other sector has lost jobs, and in some cases counted in the millions. So if solving the long-term structural debt is clearly a problem of addressing healthcare costs, addressing both the Medicare costs and other healthcare costs as well. And David, in terms of your proposal about downsizing the economy, of course the downside to that would be that there would be fewer jobs. And so if we went with a downsized economy, then we have to have a different vision for where we want the American economy to be in the future. And if we want to have a vision where, for instance, the norm is 30 hours per week instead of 40 hours per week, so that a full-time job is a 30-hour per week job, or if we want to have the norm where one partner stays home for all 18 years, with the children, so that you have a lower employment to population ratio. Those things are consistent with having a downsized economy and not having a very high unemployment rate. But if what we want is we want to have 40 hours a week as the norm, and we want to have the participation in the economy and the employment that we have in terms of when people choose to go in the labor force and when they choose to stay home and be the person keeping the home fires burning. And if we want to bring the unemployment rate down, downsizing the economy can't achieve all those things. So you may be right that where we're going to be in 2060 is in an economy with a shorter work week. Maybe we're going to have a 4-day work week instead of a 5-day work week. And a lot of people, when you say maybe we'll have a 4-day work week, they think, great, 3-day weekends. It's like with 80% of the pay. Okay, with 80% of the pay. So maybe we're going to go to a 4-day work week. Maybe we're going to go to a lower employment to population ratio. And maybe that's where we'll be in 50 years. But as a strategy for pulling us out of the downturn that we're in and pulling down the current unemployment rate, downsizing the economy only makes things worse, and doesn't make things better. The comment about Keynesianism, and I forget, it was a cute quip, but I disagreed with it, about whether Keynesians are people who never met a surplus they couldn't spend. Is that pretty close to what you said? I would, well, beg to differ, but the point I think that's a challenge for Keynesianism, for those of us who were born and bred in the C plus I plus G plus net exports way of thinking about the world, is if what we want to do now is we want to bring the unemployment rate down, right? So we have to figure out what is it that we want. If our goal right now is to bring the unemployment rate down from 10% to 8 or 6%, then it takes more spending. And we can do, as Bob suggests, well, politically, I don't think we can. Economically, we can do as Bob suggests and have a bigger stimulus package, right? So more spending creates jobs, and that would get people employed. The problem is that all stimulus packages are, by their design, temporary. And so if you have, as we have right now, if you have a 2-year package that started in February, right, of 2009, and will essentially spend itself out by spring 2011, then once that spending is removed from the economy, then those jobs are removed from the economy. Let's just put it in hard facts, right? So the ARRA money is helping to fill potholes, right? My car in El Cerrito is grateful for the stimulus money because we're not bouncing quite as much anymore as we drive along all of the many roads in El Cerrito, because that stimulus money has hired people to fill potholes. When the stimulus money is done, then those people are out of work. And so the government spending can generate jobs, but unless it becomes a permanent increase in government spending, and then there has to be something else that comes in and fills in where the government spending is. The idea, it's sort of like, to go back to the sort of hospital, because I think recovery and hospitals work so well together. To go back to the sort of medical example, right, is if you fall, not that anybody here is ever going to fall, if you fall, right, you go from falling, and then first you get the walker, and then you hope to graduate to the cane, and then you hope to graduate back to walking without assistance, right? And the idea is that using the cane is allowing you to build up your strength so that eventually you can let go of the cane and walk without falling down again, and your kids will be okay with you being on your own, right? The idea of the fiscal stimulus is if we have the government spending, that the government spending is sort of like the walker. It's there for a while we're waiting for the muscles to regenerate. It's there for a while we're waiting for the construction industry to start up again. And that's where, when Bob was talking about once things hit a bottom, eventually they start to go back up, because eventually you do have to replace the car. And eventually you do have to do something to the house, right? So that if the stimulus is there until the other spending comes back up, and then it's sort of like, you pull off, you put the walker down and walk gently with the cane, you pull back on the stimulus spending as the other spending fills in, and then the person who's been employed by the city of El Cerrito to fill potholes loses the El Cerrito job because the stimulus money is gone, but gets another job, right, working for some other industry, business industry in town, whose spending has gone up. The problem that I think Bob and I both see is that we don't see where that spending is coming from anytime soon. Is that a fair characterization?
Yep.
Yep. Good. He's so fun.
I used to believe that the way out of our debt problems was growing the GDP. And I believe that very much. And in the 40 years I've lived in the United States, I've been a great beneficiary of that. Unfortunately, after World War II in 1950s, we had an unreal growth in the GDP due to the fact that America had not been bombed and nobody had been buying refrigerators because they'd been off at war. So everybody came home, bought a house, bought a Chevy, bought a refrigerator, and that led to wonderful GDP growth. Unfortunately, I don't see any event in the next 5 to 10 years that would be as comforting for us. My concern is that you all are talking about getting the GDP back to a level that was not the GDP on steroids. In my judgment, it was the GDP on amphetamines. It's just like our undergraduates, if they want to get through a midterm, they'll take some substance, but they have to pay for that. They end up crashing for 15 hours afterwards. And what we have lost is not good, productive jobs. We've lost the job of the mortgage banker who was helping you float a loan on your 5-bedroom, 4-bath house in Brentwood. And I think that the economy was at an unsustainable level. We did learn one thing from this. I agree absolutely with what Professor Reich is saying about the effect of outsourcing. We did have, as you know, we had low interest rates, and we probably had really a period of inflation, but it was masked, and the inflation, the ordinary CPI index was quite low. Not only is your air conditioner coming from South Korea, but my green beans that I ate for dinner last night came from Guatemala, and I bought them cheap at Costco. And so the reported CPI figures were actually quite low, and it's because we really had as if 6% inflation, because money was cheap, everybody was hiring kitchen remodels, minus low food prices, low prices for your sports jacket, because we were outsourcing everything. So what did we see? We saw this huge asset bubble with house prices going up, and it looked like it was completely costless. And I don't want to put words into Greenspan's mouth, but Greenspan said he never worried about asset bubbles because he figured a bubble will burst under its own weight. I hope that one of the things we've learned from this, that policymakers, cabinet members, would now, if they saw house prices going up by 20% a year, they'd be pounding the table and say, that's not good for anyone.
I wish. Should we open it up for questions? Okay. There are microphones. There's one or two? Just the one? We've got two microphones. We've got a microphone over here in the aisle and the second microphone that Susan's going to set up.
As people are coming to the microphone, I want to recognize that Professor Brad DeLong is not with us, as you can see. What would Brad say if he were here? Can we role play a little bit around his perspective? Because I know you guys know each other well.
Brad had a graduate class, and he had tried to find somebody to cover for him, and that fell through. So he apologized and was unable to make it today. I think Brad would certainly agree with Bob in terms of the debt problems, and would argue that focusing on the long-term debt is more important than focusing on the short-term debt. Brad's been very focused on the employment to population ratio recently, and would probably have jumped in with that observation. And Brad probably, Brad DeLong, if you've heard him speak, he always then has an anecdote that no one has ever heard of before, that comes from someplace in the recesses of his brain. It's perfectly true and factual and fascinating. And that's the other thing he would do. Go ahead.
I was thinking about this aggregate demand question that you've raised, and Professor Robinson's point about the Second World War as an aggregate demand creator is a really interesting question, and hopefully we don't need another world war to create aggregate demand. And the only thing, as I've been trying to think about what it could be, the only thing I can imagine that's increasing quickly is healthcare cost, and healthcare as a percent of the economy, jobs is like 6 to 15%, and you can imagine as we age, that's actually unlike the Formica counter, and it's a question, what can we grow that people really would want to pay for? Hard to imagine people need more money to pay for anything, but healthcare is a reasonable thing that actually might, if healthcare were now 25% of our cost, that might be something we'd be willing to pay for. I'd be curious as to how you think about that. I'm not a doctor.
Undoubtedly, a rich economy is going to spend more proportionally for health care of its people than a poor economy. And we can and should expect that as we all become collectively richer, that health care does go up as a percentage of our GDP, and we hopefully live better. The problem is we are not living all that much better. Our lifespan, infant mortality, most of the measures of our health are actually way behind many other nations. Infant mortality and lifespan, both when I last looked, are behind something like 25, 26 other nations, some of them that we would not even consider to be rich nations. And 55 million Americans, or at least people living here, 35 to 40 million American citizens are not even covered by health insurance. We have the most expensive and least efficient system that money can possibly buy. It's the only system designed, because it's based upon private health, private for-profit health insurers competing against each other. It's the only system designed to avoid sick people, which is a little weird. And that's why we really do need, and I'll stick my neck out on this. I don't think in this audience in Berkeley it's going to be sticking my neck out all that much. I say it around the country, and I've said it for years, we do need a single-payer health-care system. It's the only one that makes sense. Now, you ask what else, or you implied what else could we spend our money on that we all need besides healthcare? Well, energy and the environment, non-carbon-based sources of energy, and ways of reducing the carbon in the environment. If the government were to, for example, tomorrow have a carbon tax, that would presumably create a lot of incentives in the private sector and among a lot of consumers to reduce the amount of carbon they use, but also incentives to invent and invest in new low-carbon energy sources. And that could pull us out, generate a lot of jobs, pull us out of the recession.
The other thing that I would add is when we were talking about the sources of aggregate demand, and Bob said we don't export a lot and there's not a lot of hope there. And you implied that. One of the things is we always think of exports as goods that we produce and sell to other people, right? Because the clothes that we're wearing, probably everybody in the room, the clothes that we're wearing were imported. But we also can export services. And so one of the things that the United States can export is education. And we export education by educating international students. And certainly that's an area where the United States has an advantage relative to the world, we like to think. Maybe we're the wrong people to say that, but we like to think that we have an advantage.
We do. We educate, we export education, we export entertainment.
Yep.
We're the biggest exporter of entertainment in the entire world. We also export financial services to Greece, Goldman Sachs.
Some ideas may be better than others.
My answer on what we could have more of, I like the education, by the way. I have no qualms in saying
I'm
best
just working
education,
on keeping our jobs.
Best education system in the world. But my answer is dry cleaning. And here's how it works. I used to live in Denver, Colorado for a long period of time. And my job there was to be a psychologist. I got paid for sitting there and going, And when friends in England would ask me what the industry was in Denver, I would respond, dry cleaning. And my explanation was, we used to be a railroad town, but the tracks had been ripped up a long time ago. We used to have stockyards, but those had moved to Nebraska. And as far as I could understand it, the economy worked as follows. The players in the symphony orchestra dropped off their jackets to the dry cleaners. The dry cleaners came in to see me, get their head shrunk. I bought symphony tickets. And we actually had a very nice economy there. I don't tell you this as a joke. I said to Denmark, you might think, okay, a lot of cows and butter, but it's actually people being Volvo mechanics and hairdressers and buying services from one another. So if you have the right incentives, you can have a very, very wealthy economy. If you've traveled and been to Bavaria or Austria, you can have a very, very wealthy, high-wage economy in which people pay one another for haircuts and dry cleaning.
We have two mics, so let me go over to this one.
Hi.
Hi.
So it looks like spending can take us either way toward a poorer economy or a better economy. But it seems like it's also like it's being said that spending is essential for us to have growth in the long run. So which kind of spending do we need to be participating in to ultimately grow the economy? Obviously, we don't want to all go to Tahoe. What is it we want to be spending our money on and building as a nation to have us be healthy in 20 years?
So the standard approach to answering that question is to focus on infrastructure and to focus on business investment in equipment and in structures. So that's the standard answer, right? Is buildings, machines, and infrastructure. So roads and bridges, that sort of thing. Now, included in that is technology and technological improvements. And included in the infrastructure is the education infrastructure. So having a system whereby we have really smart people who are figuring out how to do things and do things better than we've been doing them. So that's one answer.
Another answer, or at least a complementary answer, has to do with parks, recreation, the environment, public health, all kinds of things that we don't normally think of as consumption goods. They're not a matter of individuals filling their houses up with stuff, but really have a lot to do with the quality of life that we all enjoy. And what we've seen over the last 30 years is a marketization of many of these public goods. Instead of public recreation, we now have private spas. Instead of public schools, which among, Californians were among the best in the world, certainly among the best in the United States, we now have more and more private education. Instead of public parks, we have private condos and gated communities, and on and on and on. I think that embedded in that choice, and embedded in all the choices about what we want and how we want it, are fundamental political small p decisions about how we as a society are going to live our lives, what we want for each other, not just what we want for ourselves.
I would say the community college system. I think that's the number one thing I would spend money on. And then roads. Roads are a good way to get people employed, and anybody who's driven around Berkeley knows the roads need a lot of work.
Right.
I would rather have rapid transit rather than roads. I really think that we are, by building more roads, we are generating more and more suburbs, and we are generating more and more infrastructure needs. And I think smart growth, David, and again, this is a good kind of political discussion, small p. This is not a partisan political discussion, but it's the kind of thing we ought to be talking about as a nation. I think smart growth means you want more public transit, you want to have more consolidation of where people live and where they work so they don't have to commute quite as long or as much. You want to thereby economize on your infrastructure and improve your environment.
If I can tag on to that, do you think that bringing the key back to Berkeley would be a positive economic local?
The key system. The question is, should we bring back the key system? So the key system is the old train system that ran, so all the wide streets in Berkeley were part of the key system, and it took you right down to the bay, and then it took you onto the ferries and across to San Francisco. Is that? And across, well, before the bridge, it took you to the ferries, and then with the bridge, it was on. I've only heard the stories. It was the lower deck of the Bay Bridge, right? All right, good. Do we want the key system back?
I don't know anything about the key system. I've only been here 6 years, but I can tell you, light rail, where it's been tried, has been relatively successful. We have tried it very little, but other nations have tried it to a much greater extent.
Yep. Sir.
Yeah, we've been talking about what's needed in terms of the society. What's not needed are the wars we've gotten into, and that's where we put our resources. And you never hear, we can't afford a war. You can hear, we can't afford health care, you can't afford this, you can't afford that, you can't afford to fix the streets. My wife and I were in China, and we rode on their bullet trains, and they're planning to build something like at least 100 bullet trains in the next little period. I mean, we're going to be more like a third-rate country if we don't put our resources, if we keep putting them into wars, which just destroy people, would just destroy our people, and their structure, and all of that, that funds that we don't seem to question are not used for things we need here. And I think maybe somebody could guess, if we hadn't been in, let's say, Vietnam and the war since then, how much that would total and what that could have done, if anybody has some guesses. Thank you.
Oh, there's work on that, but I can't remember.
Just to be clear, we're talking about two different but related things. One is the total demand for goods and services. The Second World War probably did get us out of the Depression. Nobody wants a Second World War again. Ronald Reagan's military Keynesianism during the 1980s probably was at least partly responsible for that huge run-up in the stock market and the economy and economic growth in those years. But do we want that kind of military spending again? Probably not. The question is, if we are going to have something else that the public sector does, what should that be, or what could it be on that scale? Question number one. Question number two, could we envision a foreign policy? And I'm asking this not just here in Berkeley. I know what Berkeley would answer. You know, I just love traveling around Berkeley, and every once in a while there are people with pickets, and maybe some of you on corners saying, "Stop the war," and people honk. And it's a wonderful catharsis. But telling each other here in Berkeley,
Right, exactly.
you know, there are people outside our bubble that really need to be convinced about some of these things. And military policy is probably at the epicenter of that. If we had a policy that was really multilateral, in which we really depended upon and necessitated the collaboration with many other countries before we could make our defense policy and military engagements, that would probably be much healthier for us and for them and for the world. But we aren't far from that kind of policy. One quick story. I remember sitting around the cabinet table in about 1996, trying to get a little bit more money for job training and unemployment insurance and for worker protection on the job and for education. Just little rounding errors, little decimal errors in the budget. And I happened to be sitting there with a fellow who at that time was Secretary of Defense, and he was talking about how much they needed to have next year. It was very, very important that they have a defense budget that was at least, and he was talking about something that was probably several thousand times what I was talking about. And I said to him, well, now, if you get that defense budget, does that mean that if we have a war that we have to fight, that you are satisfied? Does that include the cost of fighting a war? And he said, no, that's just the cost of being ready to fight a war. If we fight a war, it's on top of that. And I said, well, isn't that like having a car and buying a car, but then having to pay extra every time you want to use the car? And he said, after a long pause, yes. This whole thing, once we start down the path of discussing how much we are spending and how wasteful we are spending it, wastefully we are spending it, that's just a huge and very important set of questions, as well as how many people we are imprisoning and how much we are spending on how many people we are imprisoning.
This side.
Yeah, my question is to David. You mentioned earlier you thought the answer was to right-size the economy. I'd love to hear specifically in a practical terms, how would that really work? What does that mean, really? I didn't understand the concept numerically, but not right. In real life.
I share everyone's concern about unemployment and the unemployment rate. And it was, I believe, Reagan himself who said that when the unemployment rate is 10%, it's not as if everybody's 10% unemployed. It is you're 100% out of work, and that's a very terrible situation to be in. I'm really serious that I think that we are going to do a little bit of shrinking. I'm going to assume that none of us are retirees from the prison system. Those of us who are taxpayers view the corrections department as having gotten a series of wage increases that are vastly in excess of what the market could bear and what we can afford to pay for. And there's only two ways out of that. Either we're going to have to give people 5% less salary, or we're going to hold in place and have inflation, and those wages are going to in effect come down. But shrinking would look like everybody having a pretty good job, but no granite countertops.
Sir.
Thank you. First of all, I want to commend the panel for not bright-siding us, telling us the way it is. We so rarely get all on the television. It's nothing but rah-rah about how things, even the administration's projection of the economy going forward. It's nonsense. I first worked in the White House in '73. I've been watching these things for years, and they're always wrong, and they're always too optimistic. So thank you for being very realistic. Now, Bob, I'm going to give you the chance to start talking about class warfare. I've got two sons. One is 25 and one is 19. The one who's 25 is at Google. The one who's 19 is a freshman in college. And in the event that either the older one loses his job at Google or the younger one doesn't go to work for Goldman Sachs, what's plan B in America going forward? Or is it Canada, or is it Australia? Talk about some of the other economies in the world and where a young person might think about going if they don't end up on Wall Street.
Look, first of all, let's be very clear. In the long term, the problem, as I emphasized, is not jobs, it's wages. There are and have been a huge number of jobs in the local personal service sector of the economy. When I was labor secretary, I helped preside over an expansion of jobs that totaled eventually 22 million net new jobs. No, it wasn't. It certainly was not me.
I appreciate it,
but yes. Well, that's the issue. It's wages, because the local personal service sector of the economy, retail, restaurant, hotel, hospital, surface transportation, childcare, elder care, they don't pay well. But that's where that's where the lion's share of the jobs have come from. So the real question, the class warfare question, I hate to even dignify it with those terms, is what happens to the giant, great American middle class, particularly those who all can't go to a prestigious four-year university? What will they be doing, and how will they be making ends meet? This is where we get into two very dicey subjects. Dicey subject number one has to do with everything from early childhood education through K through 12 through public higher education. And David's point is exactly right. The crown jewels of our higher education system are our community colleges. How do we finance all of this and do it well and make sure that our kids get the best quality education they possibly can? We are not doing that. We are failing them terribly in California and around the country. And so how can we possibly aspire to great jobs for them in this globalized, technologically intensive society if we don't educate them adequately? The second dicey subject has to do with our tax system. Because right now we say we have a progressive income tax, but if you actually look at the effective rates, you see that it's anything but. In fact, the IRS just published a study of the 400 wealthiest Americans, richest Americans in the year 2007. Their average income that year was $357 million each, and they paid a marginal tax rate of 17%.
And at the bottom end of that, it's deeply regressive because of the FICA tax.
That's right.
And for low-wage workers, they get hit badly. Alan Blinder, former vice chair of the Fed and a Princeton professor, has a great paper about 3 years ago in which he said what the future is going to be. And he points out that since you can digitize things and send them off to India, the economy that the United States is going to face is a bifurcated economy. And if you can do something high value added that has to be present, which for the moment, thank God, university teaching, you have to be in the same room. But personal services, turning grandma over, cutting your hair, those cannot be outsourced to India. And as we have seen, the prices for those are going to go way, way, way down. So what I would tell my grandson is to look for something that cannot be digitized and put down a pipe, okay? Dentistry is good, right? Right, dentistry, and psychiatry, although you could put that down, yes, yeah. That's how it's going to end up. Now, most of us are at a point in our lives where we have the luxury of traveling, and I think we forget just how poor the other 5 billion people in the world are. I spend a few weeks every year in Vietnam, and one of the things I enjoy doing, it's quite self-indulgent, I enjoy tipping people. And because I've got these little pieces of green paper and it makes them happy. And go to the hotel pool and tip the towel boy on my way back to my room $5. It's not a lot of money for me. And people fall over and they're just shocked. I had to calculate it out. If that guy was a manager, he's making $3 and a bit a day. So he's the pool boy. He's probably not making that much. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a lot of people out there who will do call service on telephones and so on. Long term, there's a lot of people who will do work for cheap. That's not going to go away quickly. Education.
Go ahead.
Actually, thank you for the opportunity to be here and ask you guys these questions. It's just a great honor to me. The first one is, actually I had about 25 questions, but I'm going to limit it to 3. The first one is related to education, where you mentioned, by the way, you should take notes. You mentioned education, higher education, about teaching or exporting higher education, but in fact, I think there's a trend where foreign students are coming in, getting educated, and then going back to their countries. Right. So I'd like you to comment on that. And along with education, the systemic problem here in the United States to stimulate all of our research and development, government, the research and development and to get people into higher education systemically has a major problem with primary and secondary education. And unless we fix that, I don't see how we can reach some of those other goals. You mentioned the healthcare issue, and it seems to me like healthcare costs, even if productivity goes up in healthcare industry, healthcare costs will continue to go up until we become a healthier nation. So in other words, people need to become healthier and do healthier lifestyles, I think, in order to reduce those costs. And my final question, it has to do with the banking and financial industry and the mathematicians and the economists that have come up with these ideas and schemes of derivatives and credit default swaps. Is that going away? I mean, do we have to worry about that in the future, or is that going to continue, and then maybe we should boycott large banks because they're still doing that way? Or I'd like to get your comments on that also. Thank you.
Okay. Let me take the part of the education and question. So if a foreign student comes to the United States and gets an education and then goes back home, that's exactly what it means to export education. It means that there is somebody coming in and buying a product that we produce and essentially leaving with that product. And whether they are coming to San Francisco as a tourist or whether they're coming to UC Berkeley as a student, it's still generating jobs here in the US for people who are producing services in that case that are exported. And education, we emphasize education because education is one of those things that the United States does relatively well.
Martha, could I just add here?
You
may not know that my international students, your international students, our international students pay real money. Tuition at Berkeley is now up to $10,000 for the same unair-conditioned class in Wheeler Auditorium. My international students pay that $10,000 plus another $19,000 more.
That's right.
Yeah, they're paying market rates.
Yeah. The health, you mentioned, we've talked about healthcare, and Bob's talked several times about the inefficiency of our healthcare system. One of the things that I've seen that always strikes me is the estimate is that 80% of our healthcare dollars on average are spent in the last 4 years of our life. And so, yes, we do need to have healthier lifestyles, and yes, we have an obesity problem in this country, and yes, we have the healthcare problems that result from that. But at the same time, the Medicare, getting control of Medicare is I think not just being more efficient, but personally I think that getting control of Medicare costs, getting control of healthcare costs, is also engaging in a national conversation about life and death. And that we have to see death as part of life, and that we have to, it's the circle of life. We have to be able to say, we don't want to spend $1 million to keep grandma alive for another month. And even, exactly. I'm not going there. I gave Leno 5 minutes last night, and then I didn't want to even go there last night. So, but we do, right? I mean, that 80% of our dollars are spent in the last 4 years of our life because of the measures that we take or that our families take on our behalf to extend our life perhaps by a week or a month or maybe 3 months, which is why everybody needs to have a DNR, and you need to have like 16 copies of your DNR if you have a DNR, and have it every place, because my mother having passed last August, I can tell you that if you don't have that DNR order with you when the ambulance comes, it doesn't matter. So having one copy of it in your file at Kaiser doesn't help you when you're in the hospital someplace else. So yes, so healthcare is an issue, but controlling healthcare costs is not simply about increasing efficiency. It's about choices that we make about how much money we want the system to spend to extend our loved one's life. And sometimes we're extending those lives because we're afraid of death. And until we start to see death as a part of the process of life, we're going to be spending that kind of money that we don't need to spend. Go ahead. And then there was the banking and finance.
Well, I just wanted to jump in here about healthcare, because the thing that links healthcare formally to a better lifestyle, which is the question you raised, is prevention. That's the normal and annual access of average people to a primary care physician who is going to help them do a better job with their own health. And a lot of people, if they don't get that, they fall into bad habits. They don't know what they should know, not only in terms of obesity, but in terms of exercise, heart disease, all sorts of things that you need the best primary care physicians to actually help people so they can help themselves. My father, when he turned 80, began walking 5 miles a day. He is now 96, and we have no idea where he is. No, that's not true. We know exactly where he is, and he is. But there are all sorts of studies now showing the relationship between physical activity and it may seem obvious, but getting to a primary care physician annually and having somebody monitor and work with you is terribly important. That's where the overlap is. Let me just say one thing about finance. One of the areas in which I am most discouraged today is the ability of Wall Street, its lobbyists, its campaign contributions, its revolving door lure for certain officials to stymie, a year and a half after the financial meltdown on the street, any meaningful regulatory reform. Nothing of any significance is yet happening. And when you add that to the absolutely grotesque, and I mean this, I'm choosing my words carefully here, decision of the Supreme Court in Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, treating corporations as people for the sake of the First Amendment, you have no idea what mischief this opens. I think that unless we get money out of politics and make that all of our almost number one objective over the next 5 years, nothing else good is going to happen.
Sir.
Yeah. I would like just to say that we do have a course this spring term on corporate personhood, and it was put together very quickly. Rita Marin, who's here with us, and history professor Rich Abrams. We're going to bring people from the law school and economics and other places to talk about this issue so that all of us are better informed about what its implications are. So thank you for bringing that up.
Excellent.
Well, let me just make sure we're all together. Corporations are not people.
Yeah, I'd like you to...
Can I interject just a minute? Bob has to teach yet today, so we're running up against time, so we're going to try to be disciplined, and we need you guys to be disciplined and cut to the chase.
Okay. I'd like you to comment on the idea that the problem, that there are plenty of, it's not very difficult to solve the federal long-term deficit problem. The problem is that the American public will not accept any of the solutions. That when Clinton was in, he increased taxes, cut defense spending by maybe 20%, cut other spending, and the Congress members who voted for that were voted out of office. And so right now, there's no consensus on increasing taxes, cutting defense spending, cutting Medicare, cutting Social Security, cutting anything. It's the American public who is unwilling to accept any of the answers.
Well, that's the consensus view, that the American public won't do it. But I was there in the Clinton administration. I saw the balanced budget amendment. I saw the budget balanced. And I saw at the end of the Clinton administration a $5 trillion budget surplus. We were on the way to dealing with our fiscal problems and our long-term fiscal problems. I also saw during the George W. Bush administration all of that go to hell. And much of the current problem we have is due not just to the stimulus package and the bailout of Wall Street, but due to what happened between 2001 and 2007. Let me just also say that the provisions such as, yes, military cannot be left out of this discussion, but also the prescription drug benefit and the unwillingness of Congress to allow Medicare and Medicaid to use their bargaining leverage with the pharmaceutical companies and the medical providers to get those prices down is a big, big part of the problem. We need that. We need a public option. We need to make sure that the insurance companies are competing. We need to take away the antitrust exemption for the insurance companies. Many things that we can do that don't imply a lot of additional government spending that actually could reduce the rate of increase of government spending.
Thank you. Thank you.
So under the dry cleaning example, where does the wealth come from without manufacturing? If it's just cutting hair and mowing lawns and...
We are such an incredibly wealthy economy. If you go over to, well, my goodness, just walk out the door here, but if you go over to San Francisco and stand in front of the Civic Center and look at the Symphony Hall and the Opera House, we're doing just fine if we just pass the dollars around for haircuts and dry cleaning. We're a very, very, very wealthy economy already.
So it's okay to keep offshoring all of our manufacturing?
Sure.
It's gone.
As long, I mean, there's, and behind your question is an assumption that producing some things is better than producing other things. So why it would be better for me to produce speakers than it is for me to speak, I don't know, right? That I personally can generate actually more wealth for myself by speaking instead of by being somebody who works in a speaker production factory than I could if I was working in the factory. Because the production of wealth for individuals, and the total wealth is just the sum of all of our wealth, the production of wealth for individuals comes from not spending everything you make. It doesn't matter how I make it. What matters is that when I make my paycheck, I don't go down and shop and spend every last penny of it. So it's the saving rate that matters, not what I'm producing to earn the income.
I agree with almost everything that's been said, but I think it's very important that we also not romanticize manufacturing in terms of the assembly line. Yeah. That's where a lot of jobs used to be. But go into a factory today and you see a lot of robots and numerically controlled machine tools and a few technicians and very few assembly line workers, if any. Also, look at a gadget, any gadget. I just picked this up, and ask yourself, where's the money going? Well, very little of the money that goes to produce this is going to people that manufactured it or put it together. Most of the money that goes to the people who came up with this goes to the designers and the design engineers and the manufacturing engineers and the systems analysts and the systems integrators and the inventory control people and all of the people who provide very complex services that made sure you could get this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I think you somewhat spoke to these issues, but I want to get actually back to the big P and the big D, which is the discussion today was at a very high level. You spoke to all the really crucial issues facing our country. But when I turn on my radio and I listen to the public discourse, it is really frightening to me because the issues have become so sophisticated. I mean, when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about the economy, these are not simple issues, even for educated people to understand. But the level of discourse out there in this country seems to be at such a low, unsophisticated level. I mean, I hear things like they're forcing a single-payer plan down our throats and they're taking away our constitutional rights when they do this. It doesn't matter how much Obama says it's going to be an option. It doesn't get heard. And that's just one example of the level at which we discuss these things. And then if you pair that with the big P, or the politics in Washington, where there is no consensus that we want to do something together to help this country, but can we get elected, and which corporation is going to pay for us, and we have to say what they want us to say. I don't know how we get to a point where we can implement anything that's going to get us, our country, out of the mess we're in right now. So if you can give us some hope, I'd love to hear you.
I'm going to ask Bob, because we all know Bob does the talk show circuit. So let me ask you a question based on your experience. Bob, the other thing that I've heard that I think relates to this is that part of the problem is the plethora of media means that we've got the liberal media, and we've got MSNBC, and we've got Fox. And people can listen to Fox, which can confirm their views, and they can listen to MSNBC, which can confirm their views. And back in the olden days, when we had Walter and David and Chet, thank you. We had three choices, and we all had to listen to the same three choices, and we couldn't just listen to somebody who confirmed our views. So when you're out there on this circuit, does that conform with your experience?
Well, certainly in terms of the media, we see more and more of exactly what you're talking about, Martha. People can choose to listen to or watch people they agree with. And we are all more and more in our little bubbles. I alluded to the Berkeley bubble before, but red state versus blue state, it's getting more rigid. Go 50 miles east of here, and people really do think differently. And I was on a talk show just a little while ago in which I thought I was having a fairly decent debate with somebody I disagreed with, and he disagreed with me, but we got to the station break, and the producer in my earpiece said, "Be angrier." And I said, "What do you mean be angrier? I thought the debate was going pretty well." She said, "Well, you've got to be angrier because we've got millions of people who are surfing through the channels, and they stop, we know, when they hear a really angry debate. And we've got to do that." At which point, I lost my temper. So I think that we have interrelated problems. They are the problems of us being in bubbles and not reaching out to other people, listening to only the media we agree with, and also sponsoring indirectly these gladiator contests. And what happens in Washington mirrors very much what happens in the public. Washington is not separate. It's not a separate culture. It certainly is in many ways. But what we elect people who are going to mimic very much what we do on the ground.
There are lots of really bad things about growing older. Arthritis is one of them, as many of you may know. But one of the great joys of being older is that if you see a newsreel of the McCarthy era, if you open a book that mentions what the Vietnamese appropriately called the American War, you think, oh my goodness, I remember those. How did we ever get out of that? And as you heard from my presentation today, I'm very pessimistic about our economic situation, but equally, I'm not going home to England. I'm very happy to live here. I'm very optimistic that we can lead people who are less thoughtful, we can lead them to think about these issues, and we can get back on the right track.
Yes, David, let me just say, in my experience, our worst enemy in terms of solving our problems is cynicism. And so those of you and your children and maybe even your grandchildren who are leaning in that direction, please get hold of them or yourself and say, if we are actively mobilized and energized, we can solve anything. America is extraordinarily resilient. We roll up our sleeves and get on with whatever has to be done. We put ideology aside. But when we grow bitter and cynical, we really become stymied.
I think everybody agrees or would like to agree with that, and we do hear that some today in these difficult times about American resilience, and I do like to believe in it, and I think it's real. But why is it that it seems like politicians of neither party want to look at how things are done in other countries, or at least talk about it publicly, whether it's healthcare, infrastructure, there's been a lot of discussion about, high-speed rail or whatever, or even money in politics. The campaigns are much shorter in England than they are here. I don't know how you fix that, but it's almost unpatriotic to mention how they do things in other countries. And I don't know how we can fix that. And then just it's not really related, but it sort of is. A lot lately about, well, Europe isn't perfect either. They've got this terrible problem. They don't have immigration, so there's nobody to pay for taking care of their older people. Does immigration still fit into this picture here in terms of younger people to take care of the older people, or does that make the problem in terms of unemployment worse? So,
you're the one that has to teach.
Very briefly, immigration I'll start with the immigration. Immigration does fit in. As our economy starts generating jobs again, and if we get out of the current morass, we are going to have an influx of more immigrants. Actually, we've had far less immigration. In fact, we've had disintegration. People have been leaving the country because there are so few jobs and they cannot make money and send it home. But once we do better, we're going to get more immigrants. And over the long term, given the aging of our society, we are probably going to need more immigrants. I mean, after all, the story of this country is immigration. And the secret of our success is that we all and most of our ancestors came here and survived a great deal and made great sacrifices, leaving people who were more ambitious and driven in many ways than they were back where they came from. So it's going to be a lively debate, but I very much come down on the side of immigration. But I can't remember the other question.
Why don't we look to other countries to figure out what to do?
Oh, I think that there has always been, and maybe even psychologically related to the fact that so many of us came from other countries and never wanted to look back. There is a kind of a prejudice against lifting ideas from elsewhere. That's an explanation, that's not a justification. I think that other countries have terrific ideas, have done many things better than we do, and it's really shame on us for not being willing to look back and grab those ideas.
Well, I'm all for immigration myself. You don't need to worry. The generation of students that we're teaching, they travel a lot. And one of my greatest joys in the world is to take groups of students and jump on the subway in Hong Kong. And students who've grown up thinking that the BART is absolutely the best system in the world, I say, yes, it really was in 1974, and it hasn't changed at all. And this is what a modern train system looks like. So people travel, and the generations after us are much more globally aware and bring, as a trip down any restaurant row in Berkeley will show, the best from the world comes here. So.
I think this really is a question. instead of a comment, although arthritis does happen to be diet-related and nutrition-related as much as it is aging. But I want to know if you could speak to the need for a paradigm shift, and if you know people like Helen Caldecott or Paul Hawkins, or people that talk about sort of judging economies in a different way, like people's quality of life and how much work is done that doesn't have anything to do with economics because it's not calculated. Right. And until we do do you see?
Yeah, no.
That's a question.
So the standard for economists is to use this gross domestic product, which is the measure of the total amount of stuff that we produce.
Well,
there are other measures. That's right. No, I'm getting there. There are other measures, but they don't catch on. And why they don't catch on, I don't know. I mean, is it that there's informal conspiracy amongst the economists not to let alternative measures rise up? Perhaps. Is it that, I don't know, is it that those things, people just, there's not enough people who know, and so there's not enough pressure to use them? I don't know. But so there are scholars who try to get a measure of, there's measure of economic welfare, there's measure of, what's it, the human happiness, I forget what it's called. Human Happiness Index, I think is what it's called. But they just don't catch on, and I can't tell you why.
A few years ago, I was privileged to have lunch with a minister, well, a minister from Bhutan. He was the Minister of Happiness. No, seriously, that was his official title. He wanted to talk to a former Secretary of Labor. And we had a fascinating discussion. And our discussion centered on the capacity of an economy. Because at bottom, fundamentally, we're talking about the capacity of an economy to generate all kinds of things, including leisure, including lovely public health and lovely environments, and all kinds of things that we would want and believe in. And if we can increase the capacity of an economy to do all of those things, we are by definition better off. And too often, unfortunately, whether it's the definition of GDP or it's a prejudice we have in talking about buying more stuff, we lose track of that fundamental objective, which is to live better in almost every dimension. Equality is part of that. And inequality, such as the gross inequalities we are now enduring in the United States, where the top 1% is taking home 23.5% of total national income. That's, by comparison, as recently as 1980, the top 1% took home 9% of total national income, just to give you a sense of how far we've come. The last year in our country, before 2007, when the top 1% took home 23.5% of total national income, was 1928. Yeah. And we know what happened in 1929. And we know what happened in 2008. I'm not suggesting a direct relationship, but I am suggesting that if the middle class doesn't really have the wherewithal to buy the goods and services, going back to Keynes and Martha and what we've been saying here, you are begging for trouble regardless of how you measure your national well-being.
Yeah. So we have time for the two more questions, and then he has to prep.
From your talks this morning...
Bend your mic down so it's close to your mouth. There you go.
Thank you. From your talks this morning, it seems that the imminent danger will be deflation. Yet I hear everybody talking about inflation, and I just don't see, if you could explain to me how we can inflate our way out of the problem rather than what is happening in Japan, where they are forced to deflate. And why is nobody talking about deflation as a way out?
So deflation would not be a way out. Yeah, deflation would make things worse. So deflation is when the prices that we pay, and most importantly, the wages that we receive go down. And inflation is when the prices that we pay and the wages that we receive go up. And so, in the old days, like 20 years ago, when a couple would buy a house and they would say, oh my gosh, look at this mortgage payment, and the bank, this was before mortgage brokers, the bank would say, it's okay, as your income rises, your mortgage payment will become a smaller and smaller share of your total income. And that was sort of how you bought a house over time, right? You took off a big chunk as you first bought it, and then it became a smaller chunk, not because your mortgage payment went down, but because your income went up. Deflation makes that worse because deflation, your debts you still have the same mortgage payment every month, but you have less income to pay it with. And why is no one talking about inflation? The Federal Reserve is responsible for many things, including prices. And the Federal Reserve will undertake what efforts they can, which are new and creative every day, to make sure that we don't experience prolonged price deflation because the consequences of it are so bad for the economy. So if we had price deflation for any period of time, it would take this barely emerging recovery and just...
Yeah, I touched on this last year, and what I said at that time was that usually you can have economic debates about, I think growth is going to be 3%, you think it's going to be 4%. And what I talked about last year was the great uncertainty, that it was like rolling dice. And we had a great risk of a crashing and horrible deflation. Hence, we did the stimulus and we avoided that. Now there's enough money out there and interest rates have been low for long enough that there's a great risk of inflation coming back. It's just a great time of uncertainty. And deflation would be terrible and rampant inflation would be terrible. I think we have the tools to measure and to control. I think we'll be okay.
Yes, I will agree with that, but I do not believe that anytime soon we have any realistic risk of inflation, simply because workers have no bargaining power, consumers have very, very little money, employers and producers are not going to raise prices under conditions where they can barely attract consumers. Foreign competitors are desperate for buyers. We don't have any of the conditions that normally would generate inflation. Over the longer term, we do have a potential problem because we are generating a lot of money, and the Fed is printing money, and at some point the Fed is going to have to tighten and reduce that to avoid long-term inflation.
So I had said 2 more questions, but I see I've got 2 more people. So if we can make them short.
Okay. I have 2, but I think they're both real short. One is, if you could talk about using stimulus to create jobs, assuming that's what we want to do in stimulus, create jobs, could you talk about the relative value of creating jobs and using the tax system to create jobs, the relative efficiency of that? And this may be something you don't want to deal with, but the only Berkeley economist we seem to have in the White House these days is Christine Romer. And I'm wondering if you ever get to talk to her, and does she feel as if she's been stuck in the middle of a bubble along with the president, who I think kind of created a bubble for himself with the other people that he brought around him.
So second question first, I have not talked to Christy, and she's clearly very careful with her emails when I email, so I haven't talked to her. We haven't communicated since January 20th. So I send her stuff, she sends me publications, but I don't think she's allowed. I think she's being smart. You haven't talked to Christy, have you?
Yeah, well, I was in the White House a couple months ago, and I talked to her, and she's doing great, and she gives all visible appearances of being happy in her job. She misses Berkeley. I think, though, that there are people on the economic team with whom I personally disagree, not Christy. I don't really want to get into it because personalities, who cares? I want to talk about substance rather than personalities. Your point about taxes, a tax cut versus spending, is a very interesting point, and Christy actually has done a lot of research in this area. But I can just say that about 1/3 of the stimulus was tax cuts. The problem with tax cuts, in terms of actually getting as much bang for your buck as otherwise, is that people who are deep in debt, or people who are worried, or people who have lost their jobs, they tend not to spend their tax cuts rationally. They will put the tax cut in their pockets. They will save it. That's what they should do, rationally. But when people do that over the entire economy, that means you're not going to get quite as much bang for the buck. Or they might buy something from overseas
Or they might pay down debt. So paying down debt, buying something from overseas, or putting it in your checking account and leaving it there, all of those have no effect on the economy.
Well, the latest bill that they're dealing with is a tax cut, a tax break for business on the sense that they will then create jobs.
Right. So the current idea is that if they, that's right. The current idea is if they lower payroll taxes, so that if businesses don't have to pay the 6.2% match on Social Security and the 1.45% match on Medicare, that lowers the cost to the business of hiring an employee, and maybe therefore some businesses will hire more employees. If it does, it's going to affect only those businesses that are, as economists would say, at the margin. A business isn't going to say, oh, wow, it's going to cost me 93% on the dollar to hire somebody. Let me go out and hire 7 people. It's a business that was close to hiring people, had enough demand to hire somebody, couldn't quite justify it based on running the numbers, but with a 7% savings on the taxes can justify it, whereas they couldn't before. So it may boost employment. I'm not expecting to see it boost employment a whole lot. The comments I heard Christina Romer make on the radio were simply that it's moving employment decisions closer, sooner. It's just going to move the timing of it. So a business that was going to hire in June may hire in March instead.
Keynes was very fond of saying silly things to be provocative, and he said that it didn't matter, as long as the government was spending, it didn't matter if they paid people to dig holes and then to come back the next day and fill them up, because then you had a government worker who was employed. I think very clearly as a societal value, I care a lot that we don't have a tax break that gets people going up to Vegas more often. I'd much rather have the government paying community college teachers.
And our last question from over here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is it reasonable to expect the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission to have, when it completes its work in December, a positive impact on this whole mess?
No. Unfortunately, no. I say I doubt it. I doubt it. You're up.
Well, look at Phil Angelides and the commission. They're modeled ideally on the Pecora Commission in the 1930s that did inquire into the causes of the Great Crash and the Great Depression that immediately followed, and came up with some ideas and suggestions for solutions. And some of those solutions did find their way into legislation. But having started this late in the game, when political positions are have solidified and dug in, and when the financial sector has rallied its troops to the extent that it has, I think it's hard to be quite as optimistic about the Angelides Commission having the same effect as the Pecora Commission.
So on behalf of my colleagues Dave Robinson and Robert Reich, we thank you all for coming, and we thank you for your attention.